this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Florida. And today I thought we would continue our tour of my library with another couple of books that I consider among my favorites. This time we're back in the historical section and we're looking at medieval history. And these are two books I highly recommend to you. And they are Life in a Medieval City and Life in a Medieval Village. And the authors, Frances and Joseph Gies, put out a number of books on medieval life, all of which I would recommend, but these are the ones that are actually in my library. They're published by Harper and Row. Life in a Medieval City was published in 1969, Life in a Medieval Village in 1990, and they were continually writing books on the medieval period throughout all those years. And they're very fascinating, they're very interesting, and the reason they're interesting is that they deal with the everyday lives of everyday people. Something you often don't see in history books, and certainly not in historical movies. And if you want to learn about how ordinary people lived during these periods, these are some of the best books that you can read on the subject. They talk about their homes, their customs, their legal battles, and all sorts of details about life in the medieval period. So I highly recommend them. And Life in a Medieval City obviously talks about cities. Life in a Medieval Village talks about villages, and there's a considerable difference between these things. And it goes into great detail, and if you think you know what life in the medieval period was like, unless you've done a lot of research, you may find you have a false impression. And these two books may provide details you did not know existed. So again, I highly recommend them, and they are full of fascinating stories and examples of the period in question. There's another thing that I particularly like about Life in a Medieval Village, and that is the story that the author tells in the preface, this being Joseph Gies. And he talks about growing up in this particular village where local people had a legend that on top of the hill overlooking the village there had once been a monastery that burned to the ground. But everyone who knew anything about history knew this was not true. There had never been a monastery recorded as being there. And when people heard the story from outside the village, they usually assumed that this would have been after the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. And there was absolutely no mention either of a monastery in that village or of its burning to the ground. So people assumed it was a piece of local mythology that was absolutely not true. And this is not an uncommon assumption for people to make about the remembered history of local people. But the story goes on to say that after many years, there came to be an archaeological dig on top of this hill, looking for evidence of Roman remains. And while they were looking for Roman remains, they found the remains of a monastery that had burned to the ground. But the thing about it is, it was not at the time of Henry VIII. It was much earlier, before the Norman conquest. And the local people had kept this memory alive for over 1,000 years. And I think this is a very important story because it speaks to the length of human memory and the fact that it's not necessarily wise to dismiss what local populations remember. Just because it is not indicated in the historical record doesn't mean that it may not have actually been there. And granted, one should not necessarily just assume such stories are true, but one also should not just dismiss them. And this happens all too often, especially if those local people are black or brown. And it's very important, I think, to keep an open mind regarding what people remember of their own history, whether it appears to be confirmed or not, because further down the line it may be confirmed. Another example of this is the several times in history that aluminum has been discovered and forgotten. And if you had said this 100 years ago, people would have said, no, that's not possible. But they found the remains of aluminum from several different places historically where it obviously had been discovered. And again, there was no record of it there, but they found the remains. I have another very excellent book called Corian, and one of the stories told in that book, which is not here in the library at present, it's in storage, but they talk about how they found a set of lacemakers' bobbins in this Roman-era city. And everyone knows lace was not invented until much later, but there are the bobbins. And what does that mean? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that anyone was making lace, but it means that the forerunner of that technology was better understood than people had thought. But the book also goes on to talk about how historical anomalies like this show up all the time and are simply ignored. And so there's more there that we have to learn about the past, which often simply is not remarked upon. But through study, you can find out a lot more about it. So going back to our books, these books will give you a lot more information than you probably have about what life was like during the medieval period, and I highly recommend them. So I hope you found that interesting, and in our next segment, we'll look at some more interesting books from the library. And until next time, may you blessed be.